everyone, and welcome to the Institute of International Affairs. My name is Nathalie Besser. I used to be the advisor here. Now I'm more like a security risk a bit everywhere. I'm at TT, Nyhetsbyrån, and but also writing for actually women's magazine like Amelia and International Studies, and so on. So we're going to talk about the Arab Spring and the women's situation after the Arab Spring. And we are very, very happy to have these fantastic panel and guests here with the Chargée d'Affaires for the Embassy of the Republic of Tunisia in Stockholm, Fatma Omrani Chargui. And we also have Fanny Härgestam, who is here now, also freelance reporter. We read you a bit everywhere, but you also released this book, a fantastic book about, in Swedish it's Det här är vår tid, fyra kvinnor efter revolutionen i Tunisien, which is, this is our time for women after the revolution in Tunisia, who won the Prix de la Francophonie in Suède and actually got nominated for the big prize of journalism in Sweden. And Stefan Borg, research fellow here at UI, who's been focusing mainly on the Arab Spring and the situation. And if it's okay, I would like to listen to Madame Chargée d'Affaires about how would you describe the current situation in Tunisia now for the women and what is going on as a project. You can... Yes, thank you.
I hope it's sufficiently clear. Use this one?
Oh, that's perfect.
Yes, here we go. Yeah. Do you listen to me? Yes, it's fine. Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for coming so numerous to a very interesting topic for me as a Tunisian woman. As a Tunisian woman, you always think that you know it all about your country and your rights and what you do. And then you dig when you prepare a presentation like this. And then it happens that you don't know very much. So I have been also studying to be able to have this presentation. So I have just beginning with this very touristic view of the north of Tunis. But actually, I want you to be where the picture was taken. And this is where actually the first woman of Tunisia has made her voice, Alissa, which was the Queen of Carthage. And she created this new civilization in our country. So this is just to say how that women in Tunisia have always been strong. They have always been vulnerable, but they have been very important in building what the country is now. What I will do is I will go through a very short historical overview so that you are able to see that the situation of Tunisian women began nearly 1 century ago with the new rights. So the first right that they have been able to gain was education, actually. And our first woman doctor is this lady in this very awkward picture in which she is surrounded by her male colleagues at the time. And this picture was taken in the 40s. And you can see that this is quite a very modern picture, actually. And then a turning point. In the 30s, a book has been published by a thinker in Tunisia, penseur, who was Tahar Haddad. He wrote the first book ever in history about the role of women in Islamic law and in society. And this was actually the turning point because that book was actually made of a questionnaire, an interview with the sheikh of the Islamic law in Tunisia. And this book actually inspired the present legislation in Tunisia regarding women's law. And is most part of it like the right to education, the right to political representation, and most of the several rights that we have, the right to marriage and consent, the right of marriage, is all based on an analysis of actually the Islamic laws and the Quran especially. So 1956 is the date that we see really beginning the rights of women in Tunisia. You have this very nice picture of President Bourguiba surrounded by a nice bunch of young girls celebrating this celebration. Afterwards, we have had nearly 30 years of construction of the state by which all the rights were set up. So it was the right of education, early from the 58, where you don't have discrimination for women, for girls and boys in going to schools. In the first constitution, we had the right to vote and be elected. In 1965, actually, the right to abortion was already there with some restrictions, and it was lifted in 1973, all the restrictions. In 1966, no discrimination at work from the labor code. In 72, this is a measure that doesn't exist in any of the Arab world, actually, because in the Islamic law, the girl who is an only girl with her father, when the father dies, she only inherits half. In Tunisia, she inherits all, and this is the first ever law that exists in the Arab world. And 1976, family planning, the women now got possession of their own bodies. They are able to decide when they want to have children, if they want to have children, and if they don't want, they are able to abort. And this has consolidated the rights of women in society because they are not anymore linked to fertility, but linked to their status in society. And in 1985, the international commitment with CEDAW being ratified by the government, the Convention on the Eradication of Discrimination Against Women, with several reserves. And most of the reserves are linked to traditions, mostly, because it's not really religion. Then we have a period of about 20 years by which it was the empowerment of women, but more into what we call a state feminism. Because then it was the state that dealt with the feminism in Tunisia and decided for women and did not really hear civil society and requests from the women themselves. So it was good, but still we have been able to now have shared parental authorities. We have created a fund so that women who get divorced are able to survive and get subsistence for themselves and their children. There have been amendments to the Code of Nationality by which women are now able to give the citizenship to their own children if they are born from foreign origin, from a foreign father. To the labor code as well, because until 1993, the married woman did not have authorization from her husband to be able to work. This has been lifted. And in the penal code by which we introduced the concept of domestic violence. So now domestic violence is an aggravating fact when we are dealing with these cases. 24, and then there have been several minor laws in the between. I'm just having the major ones. Sexual harassment was now into law, 2004. The age of marriage has been unified for girls and boys. It was 15 years, then 17 years for the girl, and now boys and girls are not allowed to marry unless there is a decision of the judge before 18 years. And in 2008, also, to be able for the divorced woman to continue her life, actually she gets the house, even if she is not the property. After this period in which we have been able to construct a lot of laws and actually be able to enable women in Tunisia to have more rights, then we had the so-called Arab Spring. And women in the Arab Spring have been, as during the Liberation War, Independence War, have been very active. And here you can see that it's not a question of age or of wearing or not a veil or being young or old or married or whatever. They were just happy that they have been able to change. And change for them was also be able to have their say about what was being done for them. And one important figure is this lady, actually, who has been very strong personality, as she was one of the members who actually helped to save the country from the very tough times that we had 2 years ago, 2013 was a very difficult year, and her, together with other members of civil society, have been able to save the country from chaos, actually. But it was also time for questions, because in 2011, freedom of expression and freedom of speech were there, but also we were questioning ourselves. And the questions went about identity, about religion, about the future, about the role of women in society, about the fact that are women taking the job of men? Probably it's better they stay home. There has always been rumors, oh yes, we are back to the old Sharia law by which a man would have 4 women. These were really very important times for debate. And they become very important questions when we were drafting a new constitution in which we would have rights and duties and laws for everybody. In the first draft of the constitutions, there have been several measures introduced that changed the corpus that existed before, that were to change the corpus that existed before. And there has been a strong mobilization of civil society and of women, especially, but also of men, who are convinced that women is half of the society and needs to have exactly the same duties. These questions were mostly about introduction of Sharia law into the constitution as a major source of law. And second was also an article that women would be complementary to the men. And these were very difficult questions that actually, fortunately, I am a Tunisian woman, have been withdrawn from the constitution, even if still the constitution refers to Islam as a religion of the state. So 26th of January, we have a new constitution coming in. The country was saved from political chaos, and we have been able to introduce into the constitution the idea that it's not only about citizens, but also men and women. So we recognize all the sacrifices of men and women in the revolution, but also in the independence. We recognize the enlightened reformist movements of the 30s and the 40s in the country, and we recognize the fact that we need to break through with injustice. And in that sense, the most important probably is that the respect for human rights is also coupled with respect of rights and duties, equality of rights and duties between all citizens, be it male or female. And inside the Constitution, we have several articles that are very important to this. This is the article about the equality in rights and duties that really states all citizens, male and female, have equal rights, but also that the state guarantees these rights. So there is a very strong positive position in this. Also, guarantee for economic rights, male and female. Guarantee of political rights with stating the right to election, voting, and candidacy for all, men and women, but also be able to guarantee that women are more represented and get their share in political representation. And in Article 74, we have been able for the first time to have a woman as a candidate for presidency, for the last elections. And the last article that I'm talking now about is the article in which the state actually commits itself to further protect but also enhance women's rights and equality between women and men in all the bodies, assemblies, but also to eradicate violence against women. So this is for the constitution. In terms of international commitment, Tunisia has lifted now actually in force since 1 year all the reserves that we had on the International Convention of Eradication of Violence against Women. But challenges, yes. I mean, women's rights in the world have always been challenged, and whenever there is an upheaval, they are the first ones that are touched, actually. And women are the first, probably, target that are there. So the first major challenges are implementation of the laws. In Tunisia, we have a very, as I said, a political woman yesterday, nicely written laws regarding women, but women don't know about them. Men don't know about them. So there is a very important work on enforcement and awareness. But also, there is also an important work that is now coming in with interpretation of the Constitution. And this interpretation needs that we will need to change several articles in the Code of Personal Status from 1956, that we will need to deal, and we are back on the question of culture, traditions, and identity, because interpretation is made by persons, and whatever is your political background or your cultural background, there could be a different interpretation. And also there still is a conflict with CEDAW, actually, because if we lift it reserve, we still have the declaration. And in the declaration, it states that the Tunisian government will not be able to implement or do any law or decision if it goes against the first article and the Islamic religion. So there's also a debate that is coming in on this. And the second challenge for me is empowerment. In Tunisia, still today, women are having 40% more workload than men if you have professional and private life workload. There are still half of the work that they are doing is non-paid work, actually, because it is housework, care, and services to the elderly, for example. A woman who is looking for a job has only 4 minutes a day, and a man 38 minutes. So women have less empowerment to get a job, and they need to find a way conciliate family and professional life. For political empowerment today, from 2011, only 7% of women have been politically appointed in all political bodies, from the municipalities to the government. And we have today only 3 out of 27 ministers and 5 out of 14 state secretaries in the new government who are women. In the parliament, it's getting better, but still we are now 34%. We are ranked, I think, 22 or 23 in the world as parliament, as a feminine representation in the parliament. And you see that they have two big chunks. Another, Nida Tunis, which is the center party, and another party. And all the others are smaller ones. The other challenge is a very important one. That is the horizontal equality in the electoral code. We have been able to manage to have what's so-called vertical equality, by which when you have a list, you will always have a man and a woman, a man and a woman, or women-men. But we have not been able to have horizontal equality, by which whatever political party presents lists, they need to have half of them led by men and half of them led by women. This is a challenge that will be discussed for the next electoral code for the municipal elections next year. And today the discussion is about quota. Is cybermilitantism also a way to be able to reconcile public and professional life to family life? Because you do it at home. These are some of the issues. Economic empowerment. Women are far better educated than men in Tunisia, but still, half of women that have a university degree are not able to find a job. And only 6.5% of entrepreneurs are women. And only 4 companies have a woman on the board from the biggest companies. This is also a big challenge, even if they have been able to study, and you can see that there are plenty of pharmacists and doctors and judges and lawyers and others. Violence against women. A study has been made actually with the help of the Spanish Corporation. And what is quite striking in this is that more than half of the women think that violence is something ordinary and that we don't need to talk about it. And only 70% go and denounce any violence act. And the first person they denounce who is not the police. They begin with family, probably NGOs, but the police is the last one So there is work to do on that. But there has been also a national conference in 2014, and a law is now discussed so that we are able also to be on top on this issue. Today, how do we work on this? I mean, what we gained from the revolution is actually the ability to have debate, to have consultation, to find consensus, that we have a strong civil society. We have nearly 700 so-called feminine associations that are working on gender equality in Tunisia, and that we have actually also institutions, ministry, commissions, but that's only 0.37% of the budget of the state, not even 1%. And this is a very horizontal question, and we tried since years to have it as a mainstreaming agenda in all economic and political and social development, but still we are very far from that. So today, I mean, just to be a little provocative, I mean, if we think that Tunisian men is misogynistic, probably the woman is also more, and you must educate women. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will discuss the structurals, why Tunisia became this unique example after the Arab Spring. But first I would like to hear your story about these 4 women that you've been following for quite some time, your major findings, sort of, of your work in Tunisia.
Okay, should I...
As you wish.
I take a few minutes to present, yeah? Okay, wait. So, can you hear me? Yeah, perfect. So yeah, my name is Fanny Härgestam. Thank you for this presentation, Fatma, and thank you, UI, for inviting me here. I have written a book on Tunisia the last few years that is about women. And this question that Fatma has very well touched upon now in her speech. I will start from the basic to give an idea of what I have been working on and why, and sort of what my findings have been. Even though I have not been working academically, I'm a journalist, so I've been writing a feature, really, a story, or more specifically, for people's story of what happens, what can happen inside a person when their society goes through very fundamental changes. Let me see. Right, so Tunisia. So this book is called, like Nathalie said, Det här är vår tid. It means basically, this is our time in English. And the idea to this book was born in 2011. I did not know Tunisia at all. I was working on completely other things, Latin America for the time being. And then this so-called Arab Spring came along, and I got really curious. I was quite a new journalist, I didn't have much experience, but I understood that what was happening in the Middle East at this point would affect the region for a really long time. So I decided to go to Tunisia because it was quite a pragmatic decision. I didn't dare to go to the other countries because I was, a girl, a freelancer, didn't have any protection with me. And Tunisia seemed from the beginning fairly safe. So I went there for the elections in October 2011 that Fatma also mentioned, Tunisia's first free elections ever. And I didn't know what to expect when I went there. But what struck me during that first trip, which was just for a few weeks really, was this tremendous energy. People were really happy and really proud, and all the Tunisians were saying to me, now we're going to build this new country, now we have all these opportunities, now we can start from the start and we can construct the democracy as we wanted. And at the same time, there was this worry, there was this particular fear regarding specifically women's rights. Because as Fatma mentioned too, Tunisia is particular in the region. And it has had, for the past decades, a specific status for women with the code, the personal status code. And the fact that women could decide to divorce, polygamy has been forbidden for a long time, women in Tunisia have the right to abort, and there was a worry among many women that these rights would be taken from them. Why? Because the Islamist party was on the rise. The Islamist party had been quite, they had been absent from the political stage, like many other political actors, because the party was forbidden, it was banned. And then in the elections of 2011, they got many votes. They won the elections. So a lot of people thought, how is this going to turn out? What are they after? What do they want? How conservative are they? Are they for or against the code, the personal status code? These were all questions that no one had the answer to. And many representatives of the Islamist party, men and women, said, no, don't worry. We're not going to take away the code. We're not going to implement Sharia laws. We're not going to do this. But still, there was this worry. And that's when I decided I want to write about a few women, follow them in their work, and to see where will this all go, and how will they experience these coming years. Regardless of what happens, how will they live it? So I chose 4 women, where 3 of them were part of this Constituent Assembly that Fatma also mentioned, the body that was in charge of writing the new constitution. Let's see if I'm going to change picture. And this assembly was placed in Bardo. Bardo is the name of the Tunisian parliament. And the 3 politicians, and then a 4th woman that is not a politician. I will tell you a bit more about her later on, but right. So I was thinking I'm going to present these women to you and explain why I chose them and who they are. One is Selma. She's 50, a doctor from the upper middle class in Tunis, mother of 2. She's never been politically engaged at all. But she kind of woke up with the revolution and decided she wanted to work for her country. So she put herself out there, she became the candidate, and she was elected to the assembly. And she has sort of a secular left vision for Tunisia. She's strictly against everything that has to do with Sharia laws. That's how she would phrase it anyway. She lives, personally, I would say in quite a Western way as we know it. Like in her family, they drink alcohol, they live in a villa with a pool. She and her daughter, they swim in bikini. They have, that kind of lifestyle. She doesn't go to the mosque to pray. She doesn't, practice religion really. And Selma, from the beginning, had this quite clear vision of Tunisia as a secular country, with France kind of as a model. And then we have Mehersia Labidi. She was supposed to be here today, actually, but unfortunately she couldn't come. She's from the Islamist party. She has lived many years in France, where she worked as a translator. She left in the 80s. And Mehersia had from the beginning, a different vision of Tunisian society than Selma. For her, the basis was, from the beginning, the religion. And she wanted to see a new Tunisia thrive within sort of the frame of Islam. That would be the core in her new Tunisia. But, Mehersia belongs to quite a moderate side of the Islamist party. We're not going into too many details, but there are also within the Islamists different ideas of what kind of society to shape. Oh, that's a picture of Mehersia's door. I've been waiting in front of this door many hours during the past few years. She's often away and she will never even give you an idea when she comes back. So. And then we have Mabrouka. She is the youngest of these 3 politicians. She is 34 now, if I don't remember wrong. She has also been living abroad for quite some time during the dictatorship before 2011. And she came back, a bit like Mircea, felt that she kind of got sucked into the revolution and that she had to do something for her country because she was already working in the field of human rights and in development, but with other countries in the region. So Mabrouka lived for many years in the States, and she came back to Tunisia to live for the first time. She has never lived in Tunisia. She came back in 2011 when she was also then elected to parliament. And Mabrouka kind of, from the beginning at least, found herself in the middle of the Islamist and the leftist camp, if I simplify things by describing them that way. She was very attached to the concept of universal human rights. That was kind of her leading word. And I remember she was describing to me in the beginning of debates on the constitution, how she would sit on one side of the table with some of her fellow colleagues from this same political perspective and have kind of quite conservative Islamists on the other side, because in her group, in her parliamentary group, there were some quite ferocious Islamists that were very openly for Sharia laws, for example, to put a formulation on Sharia laws in the constitution. And Mabrouka was saying to me, I was just throwing it out there. I was saying, universal human rights, universal human rights. And the Islamists, they were throwing back at me, Islamic values, Islamic values. And she described, we were sitting there on these different sides of the table for weeks and weeks and just like throwing these words at each other. And then finally, with time, they kind of created a text that somehow included both these concepts in different ways. Sorry, maybe I'm rambling on. Do I still have some time? Yeah? And then, very importantly, there may not be... we're going to speak a lot about the constitution today and the laws in Tunisia and the general situation for women, among other things in the political landscape. But I still want to tell you about Amira as well. She's the fourth woman in this book that I've written. She has nothing to do with the constitution writing. She's simply a normal, ordinary Tunisian citizen, but she was also very affected by the revolution, not in the same way as these three politician women, but as a woman and as a person, in the sense that her husband was killed, actually. He was shot, most likely by police. No one really knows who shot him. And Amira has small children. She's quite young. She's in her 30s. She lives in the countryside in a tiny village. And she, before the revolution, was living a very calm, controlled life where she was completely dependent on her husband. She didn't work. She didn't finish school. And suddenly her husband dies in the revolt, and she's on her own. So I decided I also wanted to follow Amira along to see what her life would turn out like with these years, and how she as a woman would be affected by these changes. And for Amira, the issue was never really political, and the whole concept of women's rights and freedom, for her it was just completely personal. For example, she is not a person that can move around freely. She's very controlled by her surroundings. When her husband was alive, her husband controlled her. When he died, the village and the larger family, her own family, her dead husband's family, all of them would try to control her in different ways. So to start off with, she was very sad with the revolution, whereas most people, and men and women, felt that the revolution gave them something, freedom most of all. Amira was struck by this sadness and this sorrow. She lost someone she loved. But at the same time, and with time, she also noticed that somehow this new situation kind of gave her freedom, because her husband was, to a great extent, bad for her, and extremely controlling and violent to her. He hit her and would not let her lead her life the way she did. So I've been following these four women through these years, and they've all changed, of course, with the evolution in Tunisia. They've changed immensely. I would say what's been common for the three politician women is that they have at first grown apart, and then they've kind of reunited again. Grown apart in the sense that, and you touched upon this, Fatma, there have been great political polarization in Tunisia, especially regarding the writing of the constitution, between what's somehow called the secular camp and the Islamist camp. And there has been great distrust between these two. So, for example, Mercia from the Islamist party and Selma, the doctor from the secular left, they have in periods, I wouldn't say hated each other, but they have been ferocious political enemies. And that has created a lot of problems in itself. To me, at some points, it was quite obvious that they were not actually that far apart on some issues. But the fact that the distrust between the Islamists and the opposition was so deep, it all kind of just took a bad turn. And so they have really had a big, this is still a challenge in Tunisia today, the fact that there is this deep distrust between the two camps. And they know, I mean, even though I say that, sometimes it's almost as if these problems have been magnified by the distrust in itself. It's also clear that they do have fundamental differences in their vision of society. I mean, Selma, for example, she would until the end say that we should not have references to the Quran in the constitution. Whereas for Mercia from the Islamist camp, this was completely normal because that's what she would like to see society based upon. But towards the end, like I also mentioned, then Fatma, they got the constitution together with these two ingredients. So I would say in the end, and I write about that in the final chapter actually in my book, when they finally wrote the constitution, none of them is completely happy. The two of them have things that they would have liked to have seen in the text that are not there. But both of them say, it's all right. We both got something. I mean, for Selma, it was very important to state, for example, that that Tunisia is a civil state. And for Mercia, for example, it was important to have the references to the Quran. And both of them are in there. Right, I've touched upon this. And when it comes to Amira, and regarding the changes during these years, like I mentioned, for her it's been all more personal, and she has, in a way, discovered herself, and she has discovered what she is able to do and what she would like to do. For example, she discovers that she wants to travel, and actually during the work on the book, she often used me as a reason to do this. And this is something that bothered me in the beginning. I was a bit worried that what if something happens, and is this okay as a journalist to let someone in like this? She would lie to her whole family and to her village and say that she was going off on something, and actually she came to see me in Tunis, and she would call me and just be like, I'm in Tunis. Let's go to the sea. And she would discover that she wanted actually to be in contact with men. I mean, she was very sad after the death of her husband. But she also recognized, not the very first period, but after a few months, that he was not the best man in her life in all ways. He did give her a lot of safety in a way. Economical, she didn't ever have to worry about anything in that sense. He would provide for her, but I mean, he wasn't he wasn't really her partner, and she knew that, and I noticed with her that she knew that, and she started to say to me, like, I would like to meet someone that really cares about me and someone who really loves me in a way that's honest and that lets me do these things that I would like to do, to travel and dress in jeans and not only in a black long dress, which the village wanted her to dress like, etc. So it's been a real, I mean, for me personally, of course, it's a tremendous experience to see these changes during these years and to follow these four women, which in their own way have fought so hard for what they believe in. And what's united them is that they have all tried to find their new place in the new Tunisia and kind of create a world that they would like to live in, but on very different levels. Right, so I think I'll stop there for the time being, and I'll...
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Stefan Borg, research fellow here at UI, focusing on the Arab Spring, please.
Yeah, thank you, Fatma, and thank you, Fanny, for such interesting talks. And it's great to see so many of you here this afternoon. In my talk, I'm going to touch upon similar issues, some of the same issues that have come up. But as a political scientist, I'm going to highlight the historical tendency to instrumentalize women's rights in service of political ends in Tunisia. That's, of course, a tendency that is not specific to Tunisia, but a tendency that we see in many other countries in context too. So ever since Tunisia's independence from France in 1956 and the promulgation of a series of laws known as the Code of Personal Status, Tunisia has enjoyed an international reputation for a rather progressive approach to women's rights. In particular, of course, if you compare to other countries in the region. And it's true that ever since the 1950s, Tunisian women have enjoyed greater legal protections than their counterparts in other Arab countries. The Code of Personal Status, as we heard previously, rather dramatically increased the status of a woman under the law. For example, polygamy was outlawed, women were granted the right to divorce, and marriage required mutual consent. The Code of Personal Status was very much the work of the first president of modern Tunisia, Habib Bourguiba, who was president between 1957 and 1987. Interestingly, if you today visit Bourguiba's mausoleum in Monastir, you have to pass through the heavy door on which it says the supreme combatant, the liberator of women, and the builder of modern Tunisia. So these headings pretty well sum up the legacy that Bourguiba wanted to leave behind. Though Bourguiba wanted to leave such a legacy behind, today many observers view the Personal Status Code from the mid-1950s as a product of a kind of Ataturk-style benign despotism, the work of one man, rather than as a reflection of a shifting societal consensus in favor of women's rights. So, kind of the attempt of a state to monopolize the control of women's rights that has sometimes been called state feminism, as Fatma mentioned. And that was certainly a tendency that became more and more visible, and especially as we move on to Bourguiba's successor, Ben Ali, who came to power in 1987 and remained in power until 2011. And Ben Ali, in some ways, followed Bourguiba's relatively progressive approach to women's rights. For instance, a bundle of reforms were passed in the early 1990s, which granted women greater child custody rights in the event of a divorce, and also removed stipulations from a personal status code that stated that women had to obey their husbands. Still, Ben Ali left some of the most perhaps problematic sections of a personal status code untouched. Regulations concerning women's inheritance, and unmarried women and their children remained unrecognized under the law. More critically, perhaps, to take a more critical approach to what Ben Ali did, many observers today would argue that Ben Ali often co-opted various elements of the women's rights movement and agenda to promote his own power, rather than to extend rights to Tunisian women for its own sake, so to speak. So arguably, Ben Ali's kind of state feminism was even more so than Bourguiba's, a discourse used to satisfy Western donors, as well as to co-opt groups that may otherwise have turned against the regime. So as part of this, Ben Ali, rather successfully, one may argue, insisted that Tunisians faced kind of an either-or choice. Either his own stable, secular, modernist dictatorship, or that they had to face an unpredictable democratic government ruled by highly illiberal extremist Islamists. And in this framing, by framing the situation like that, Ben Ali managed to convince many Western observers that his regime kind of represented the lesser of two evils, in a way. So, in Tunisia's post-independence history, both Bourguiba and Ben Ali attempted to popularize a narrative of Tunisian modernity as progressively linear, secular, and kind of inherently supportive of women's rights. So in this narrative, women's rights played an important role in helping to portray Tunisia as a secular, progressive oasis in an otherwise patriarchal desert. During Ben Ali's rule, a number of secular women's rights organizations rose to prominence in the 1990s, and they were allowed a certain degree of freedom. This laid the foundation for the emergence of a strong and vibrant civil society that both of our speakers have mentioned, and a civil society that has been very active and very influential after the revolution in 2011. More so, arguably, than political parties. By intervening at decisive moments in the post-revolutionary period, and especially in matters concerning women's rights. So what then happens after the revolution? Let me also just say a few words about that. So the crucial transition period from January 2011 until the elections in October 2011 saw a pluralization of women's movements in that secular women's rights organizations, we now also faced competition from Islamist women's groups. Islamist women's groups often emphasize that they were actually the most oppressed during Ben Ali's regime, whose ideal of a modern, westernized woman in many ways was at odds with a pious and often veiled woman. So when I interviewed representatives for the major secular women's rights organizations in Tunis in November and December last year, certainly the general impression that I got was that in the early months of the Tunisian Revolution, such women's rights groups were hopeful that more rights might be claimed in the democratic opening following the fall of Ben Ali's regime. Many women rights activists, they talked about not only a strong presence of women in the demonstrations against the regime, but also about prevailing sentiments of gender equality among the protesters themselves. But in a few months' time, after the overthrow of the regime, Tunisian secular women's rights movements, they kind of went from a situation in which new rights were being brought up for discussion to a situation in which the struggle largely became a matter of retaining existing rights in the face of what they perceived as a looming conservative, deeply reactionary backlash. Yeah. In the elections in October 2011, the moderate Islamist party Ennahda did, of course, very well, became the largest party in the assembly. And although, as Fanny has pointed out, Ennahda is far from a monolithic movement, right? There are certainly elements within it with highly conservative views when it comes to the role of women in society. So in many ways, in the aftermath of a revolution in 2011, the traditional Bourguibist identity of a Tunisian modernist secular state became subject of intense contestation. For the moderate Islamist party Ennahda, or a movement, it's more of a movement perhaps than a party, the question was how to make democracy and political Islam compatible. Ennahda sought to reconcile Islam with modernity, not in the secular and autocratic way of Bourguiba and Ben Ali, but in a manner that would pay more attention to the particularities of Tunisian culture and Islamic identity, as they understand it, of course, while adhering to modern principles such as democracy. So in Islamist discourse, there is this desire to return Tunisia to an authentic Arab Islamist identity, which they think have been distorted by modernist westernized elites. But for the secular women's rights organizations that I spoke to, that project is of course seen as deeply threatening and a deeply dangerous project, right? So in the rather polarized political climate between secularists and Islamists, the role and status of women has been a very symbolic issue. For example, for over a year, a particularly controversial article of great symbolic importance in the post-revolutionary constitutional draft was fiercely debated, and as we've already heard about this constitution, but this debate, part of it at least, centered on whether the term equal or complementary should be used to describe a woman's relation to a man in the constitution. And whereas women's rights groups of a secular bent, of course, emphasize the importance of women as referred to as equal, at first at least, Ennahda or elements within Ennahda preferred the designation of women as complementary to men. But following an intense mobilization of civil society activist groups, as well as demonstration in Tunis, which gathered as many as 7,000 people, Ennahda backtracked. The notion of complementarity was entirely scrapped and replaced with one of equality. And the constitution that was approved in early 2014 is usually seen as a very democratic constitution, very pro-women's rights constitution in many ways. And as, again, like Article 46, for example, right, states even that the state shall seek to achieve parity between men and women in elected assemblies. It also states that the state shall seek to take all necessary measures to eliminate violence against women. So Tunisia's new constitution is certainly, I think, almost universally seen as a victory for women's rights. Now, it's of course one thing to have a good constitution, to have a progressive constitution, another thing what's actually happening on the ground, so to speak. That is probably where the great challenges lie. And there is a chance, of course, that democratic gains for women could be reversed. As history has shown in Algeria, in Iran, also if you look at the French Revolution, revolutionary movements don't always lead to greater gender equality or a more inclusive politics. Women often fight fearlessly in such liberation struggles, sometimes only to be sidelined when the new national governments are being formed. But in Tunisia, the transitional institutions did a really good job, I think, of including women in those transitional institutions. For example, the body that wrote the constitution and so on. And that, coupled with a strong and vibrant civil society and strong women's rights organizations, is very promising, I think. So I will stop on such a hopeful note.
We'll soon take some questions from the audience. It was very interesting that you mentioned this transitional council, because in this phase you can really see that there are some actors that are actually crucial to how things actually developed. We have the military, actually, or the security system, always, where we could see that in Egypt, if we compare these two, made a totally different way to handle the Islamists coming. And then we have the Ennahda, which is a total drama in itself. How this party came up, how it adopted to the revolution, and how it's acting now. And at one point, it was the great winner of the parliamentary elections. If we start out, because these are structural sort of questions to the issue of Tunisia, this transitional council has been named as one of the crucial facts. I mean, what actually made this Tunisian transitional phase sort of a success? Any comments on that? I mean, what role did this council actually play? Stefan, if you want to.
I think perhaps that it served as an arena to bring together actors, so that actors who kind of ideologically perhaps stand like sometimes very far from each other could actually have an arena where to meet, where to meet regularly, and where they could work out compromises. And I think generally speaking, the Tunisian case is really also a story about political compromises, and that actors, that politicians are really willing and able to compromise, and that I think sets it apart from, let's say, Egypt, for example.
And that's also then the actions of Ennahda, the Islamist party, if you compare to the Muslim Brothers in Egypt. Could I have your comment on first the council, the role of the council?
Well, actually, the council was a request from the street. If you remember, in February, 1 month after the revolution, we had several three demonstrations in the street asking that all the law should be rewritten in Tunisia, and asking that all the legislative corpus would be withdrawn and write a new constitution. And this was a request from the street. People have been sleeping in the streets for that and asking for that. So it has been very crucial in instead of polarizing the problems in the street, you had an arena, as you said, that where you had all major actually political tendencies from extreme right to extreme left being able to talk, being able also to bring it to the debate, public debate, in television, in radios, in gatherings, and that had made it probably smoother than having violent, strong demonstrations in the street. This has been a very valuable job actually they have been doing. Yes.
And what kind of power was it that admitted this council? I mean, is it the military structure behind? Because that's what we see in Egypt. They didn't actually permit this. What role did sort of the deep state of Tunisia play in this?
Tunisia has never had a very strong very strong forehead of the military. Military is there, it's for security, has always been thought by the people as part of the development. You would see young soldiers going to the camps and helping olive tree campaigns, for example. This was what people thought about it. So that was why it was not very problematic, the role of the army during the first days and the first weeks of the revolution, because there was trust with the
social
army.
Contract
Absolutely.
between the people.
Absolutely. So you would see, like what happened in '74 in Portugal, people even bringing flowers to soldiers because they were helping them in keeping streets quiet. And you would have in neighborhoods the military tank together with youngsters in the street defending what they thought was to be defended from outsiders. So the military was not really a very, they had probably more like a conciliation role during that time. And Tunisians actually thought that violence was not the solution. All requests were under more or less peaceful. We were not very bloody in this revolution, even if we had our toll of death penalty. But still, people thought that the change of government was a request. They did not request to kill people, and the change and to be able to reform the law. So we were also believing that law is probably the foremost and important thing that was to change. Yeah.
You wanted to?
Yeah, so just a very quick follow-up about the role of the military, which I also think is so important, and really when we talk about this in a comparative perspective, that because the Tunisians that I spoke to, they often they did not so much trust in the police force, the security, the security sector, but they did have very high trust of military. So the Tunisian military, they had, historically built a certain aloofness, right? So they were not at all seen as in the same category as regular police force and so on. So.
And that's why they have been able to have that kind of mediator, because you see, the highest general going to demonstrators, ask them to be quiet, less violence, and be able to be a conciliator between the political forces and the people in the street.
So the social contract between
Absolutely.
the people and this force, sort of. Any comment on that from your case-based perspective?
No, I think you basically covered it all very well. I agree.
So, very short then about Ennahda as a political power and the transformation, this Islamist coming up from the hidings. I mean, they didn't used to be able to act politically, and now where is Ennahda now? Very short. Anyone who wants to, I see you.
Right, I think Ennahda is in a phase of re-evaluating itself as a party, and a lot of analysis after the elections said something like, now look at them, and this is the perfect occasion for Ennahda to take a step back and to actually sort of regroup for the near future, and to analyze also why they didn't effectively win the elections. And to also deal with, what was briefly mentioned here, I mentioned it, and you too, Fatma and Stefan, what's their internal division, which is something that is deep in the party, and something that actually was shown publicly for the very first time in history through the issue of women's rights. But that's kind of, I won't develop on that because I think it's going to take a while, but it was very interesting to the public to actually, during the very last days of the constitution work, to see this clash between Nahdawi's in the hall of Bardo. Everyone had known that there was a division within the party, but that was the very first time that it was actually shown.
Where is Ennahda today? Sort of?
Well, actually, after the last elections in October, everybody was waiting for what Ennahda would do. And when the official results have been announced, we were waiting. Because Ennahda won the election in 2011, and they had more than 40% of the total voters. They were down to a little bit more than 30%, 33%. And it was a question of, will the country go to chaos again, or is it going really to be an Islamic democratic party? And I think they have shown, at least at that time, that they were politically responsible, and like a major political party would do, and that they believed in democracy. So now they are part of the government that is now leading the country for the next 5 years. They have a very big and very tough ministry, actually, because it's a ministry where it gathers all the problems, employment and vocational training. It will be tough for them as well, as members of the government. But I think that in Tunisia, we have been able to put the word democracy somewhere high on the agenda.
So we open for the floor, questions from the audience. If you have the microphone, if you introduce yourself and then ask the question. Yeah, we can start.
Sayda Sineson. I want just to say to Fanny that the examples that about the woman, it's a very good example, but I think Amira is the best because Amira, I'm saying that because I'm sociologist. So Amira, it's represent big part of woman, of Tunisian woman, because Tunisian woman, it's still controlled by tradition, by religion, and I think Amira, it's a good example because all the time, if we compare Tunisian by Arabic word, we say we have a lot of rights, but I think if we compare by Western world, we say that Tunisian women, they have a long way to do many things.
Yes.
Thank you, Ambassador of South Africa. Thank you very much for the presentation. I think it's very impressive to know that Tunisia has taken such a progressive and revolutionary stance in supporting women issues. Discrimination in itself is a very appalling phenomenon, whether it is based on gender, whether it's based on religion or color or whatever. But usually, when it comes to the differences and the views that people would have differently, and also the ideological backgrounds that they have differently, and from different political parties, usually when it comes to women issues, women would, irrespective of all those differences, would come together and will say these are the issues that we need to address and our voice will be heard. Now I want to ask from Fanny, if you read that in Tunisia, that women would be sitting, and irrespective of their ideological backgrounds, would they be sitting down to say these are the issues that are affecting women?
I'm really happy that you bring up that question, actually, because it's been very present during my work. In the very beginning, that was the stand from a lot of women. They tried to form this parliamentary group even across the parties. But it turned out that when they met, they just kind of started to fight. They had quite chaotic lunches, and it was just like physically even quite someone running off and crying and like very messy. And it turned out that what I mentioned earlier about the political polarization really affected these things. So there was a long period during the constitution writing when they didn't meet. And Selma and Mercia, for example, they would just stop talking to each other. And so it was physically clear to me that they grew apart. But what happened was that towards the end, and this was something that really touched me very deeply in Tunisia, the very last scene I have in my head when I think about the parliament was the day when they actually voted the constitution. And I would physically see from above, from the balcony, how Selma and Mercia and when the Islamist women from one side and the secular ones from the other side would literally move towards each other in the hall when they all gave up and started giving each other hugs and celebrating. And they will tap each other's shoulders and be like, good work. I don't like your views, but you're all right. And I think that was, I think this says something about Tunisia to me.
Där i mitten men då kan vi kanske ta den här emellan medan den transporteras dit. Eller ska ni båda två? Ja. Börjar du då så. Ska jag börja? Okej.
Katrin von Härgestam. Thank you very much for giving, I would say, the background to today's situation. And I would be really interested to hear where we are today, because we know that you showed it also. There is a lot of women are well educated, but they don't have any jobs. We also know that there is this division between those who belong to parties Enada and to the other party in Ida Tunis, but there is not much in between. So I would be, and we hear that there is problems in about the law against violence against women, and many, and I now start talking about many problems, but I have a feeling that all the background is now very safe, but how can the women continue and engage in politics? Young women just say that they don't recognize the politics for that they had been fighting for, and so on.
That's perhaps, if you want to comment.
Actually, I wanted to comment also on your thinking that Amira was probably the best example. Actually, what you see as a sociologist is that Amira is actually crystallizing the problems and the challenges that we are having in Tunisia. So how you are able to be an educated, probably, women, having the future in front of you, but not being able to have your say on several things, and this is where the challenges is. The difficulty is that in crystallizing all of this and living in a very small village make it more difficult. Here you see the difference between rural and urban areas, in which in urban areas, even if you belong to a smaller family or you live in a periphery or in suburbs, still you have the way to go to the sea and have a deep breath and think about it. There it's very difficult when you are in a small village. So Amira is probably the example crystallizing the difficulties of women in Tunisia in a way. If we go to women empowerment, yes, they are very highly educated, but we are still in a country where, unfortunately, and it's also in the Code du Statut Personnel, and this is need to be changed, in which women, in which the father is the tutor of the family, and until he's divorced or passed away, he is the one who decides for all, especially the children. The woman has been able to gain independence, but in Tunisian women's tradition and culture is still very strong. And what I finished as a very ironical way, it's true that we need to educate women, because still we are reproducing ways of life that existed 30 years ago. So if I had a boy, he would not do exactly the same thing as my girl, because we are used to have the boy staying in front of television and the girl doing the housework. And it will go like this until we are able, us women, to think about it.
Now it's Danny.
Hello, my name is Danny Cohn, and I'm interested in anthropology. So I will frame a question specifically for you, but maybe for somebody else also. I saw on your picture and took up the Constitution. It's in the beginning there. It says that you said, with the loyalty of blood and virtuous martyr to the sacrifice of Tunisian men and women over the course of generations and breaking free from injustice, inequality, and corruption. And when I hear you talk about what happened in the parliament, it's nearly a sacrificial right. I mean, people are fighting each other, but in the end there is a release, and you have this common. And I just wondered for you if you can address or have a guess of this sacrificial thinking that might actually hold Tunisia together. Is it coming far away, or is it just something which happens through the 18th century, or do you have any idea?
Actually, when I was commenting the first picture, I talked about Elisa. She was the first woman to compromise, because the deal about Carthage was a compromise and being able to to have a peaceful coexistence between different civilizations. And I think this is the background in which Tunisia has been living in through the centuries. We can say that Tunisians have never gone to war in a way. We have always been colonized or being a field for battles, but Tunisian people themselves have never gone to war and have never decided that they will settle somewhere and colonize people. So we have that very kind of particular way of thinking by which peaceful coexistence is important, but also that probably is a way, and I'm talking on my own behalf, I'm not talking on behalf of the Tunisian government or whatever. This makes also Tunisian people be able to accept more authoritarian way of leading politics, because till it is peaceful, we are fine. That could be also what you are thinking of.
Okay, my name is Mats Fält. I'm a freelance writer and a president of the City Council in Tunisia. And I was thinking about this constitutional aspect. There are, many say, wonderful constitutions in, for instance, Brazil and South Africa. They promise everything to everybody, and it's very obvious that it doesn't work, because many of those things that are written will never be realized, or at least not for 50 years. And when you noted what's written in the Tunisian constitution, I got a little the same feeling, that the state is supposed to guarantee money, food, work, and all kinds of things, and probably that will be very, very difficult. Isn't there a risk that if you promise everything to everybody, and then when you see that things don't work out, other things such as maybe rights for women will also be viewed as, well, that the other paragraphs don't work, so why should we put so much effort in this one? Is it a problem to promise everything to everybody?
Yes, actually, I did not finish my presentation really, because Tunisia is now being faced with two major problems. One is security, and the second one is economic development. If in that there's also the possibility that we forget about women's rights. So I think that if the government forgets, there's a ministry who is dealing with this, and they need to get some job at some point. And also we have very strong feminine organizations and gender defensive organizations that are quite strong in Tunisia. They have 40 years, 50 years of struggle behind them. So I think that even if we forget or we omit, there's will be someone who tells us what to do. Thank you.
Did you want to comment on that, or Fanny or Stefan? No? Last one. Question over here. Nothing in the back, no. So if we, and then second, yeah. First there, since the microphone is there, and then.
Thank you very much. My name is Inga-Britt Alenius, and as a very young economist, I worked for 3 years in Tunisia in 1963 to 1965 with the La Société Tunisienne de Banque. And it so happened that I was on leave from a Swedish commercial bank, where I was told that I couldn't count on being promoted because they had to take into consideration, of course, the interests of their clients. But when I came to La Société Tunisienne de Banque, I had 2 women supervisors. This was a very dynamic period in Tunisia, and it's also referred to in the pamphlet issued by the Utrikespolitiska institutet. It was the phase of le démarrage économique de la Tunisie, and you have the le supreme combattant, the supreme fighter, who made a point of the emancipation of women as part of his modernization project. It was very obvious at the time that this was the case. He was interviewed and he in radio and television at the time, and he stressed very much his background, his family education, where his mother, I think his aunts, and that he was surrounded by women when he was brought up. I think it also counted, of course, that he was married to a French woman at the time. But he made emancipation of women a real part of the modernization of Tunisia at the time. And you can still find on YouTube small videos showing Bourguiba really lifting the veils of Tunisian women. It wasn't a prohibition at the time, but he came later on, as I understood. There was also a limited prohibition of carrying veils. Now, leadership is everything in my view. Now he was in the position to take the lead because he was the supreme combattant. Now, is there anyone, or is there any movement in Tunisia now that takes the lead and also marks the emancipation of women as an important thing, as Bourguiba did at the time? Mm-hmm. And I think Bourguiba is the decisive reason, the decisive person of the strong position of women in Tunisia today.
Mm-hmm. Who wants to start with that?
Well, I would say there's definitely not a figure like Bourguiba in Tunisia today, which, I mean, for better or for worse, depending on who you ask. But I would say, and I would like to make a connection to, I think it was you, Fatma, you brought this up, that Tunisia, and you as well, Stefan, Tunisia has a very vibrant civil society, and I think that it's from there that the real push forward will come, in cooperation with political figures, of course. And it's kind of, I mean, you already today see a little start of that, and I think your example, Fatma, is a good one concerning the law on violence against women. It's, as we speak, being framed right now, being developed right now, in cooperation between, I mean, of course, it's been a bit on hold with the new formation of the government, but it's almost finished. It's going to be put in front of the parliament sometime, hopefully, for the coming year. And it's been developed in cooperation between ATFT, which is one of the major women's rights associations in Tunisia, and with representatives from the ministry and also some active parliamentary representatives. And I mean, there's one example of pushing things, but I mean, it's still, I would say, quite a blank page on what shape exactly will the fight for actually implementing and pushing further women's rights, what shape will it take?
Yeah, just very briefly, Inga-Britt. I think your remark about Bourguiba is kind of, I think, really, interesting, and it shows kind of importance of leadership. And to talk about state feminism and kind of top-down politics in that sense, it's not. It can really open up space in 20, 30 years later for really grassroots activities. So I think there is it can be very, very important, and also, and it can lay a foundation for deeply democratic politics later on, that we can kind of cash in on later on. And I'm going to let Fatma talk about the question about leadership today. I mean, I guess we have Essebsi on the one hand, like founder of Nida Tunis, right, and on the other hand we have kind of Ghannouchi, and there is, of course, especially about Ghannouchi, there is so much written about Ghannouchi and Ghannouchi's views on society, and of course he's constantly being accused of having a kind of a double agenda, double discourse, or even triple discourse. And does he, what are his real views, and how much power does he have? Does he have, how much of his own thinking is behind Ennahda, and so on? But it's. But I'll leave. I think the question.
Yeah, very short, so we can Or do you see any leader
No, really. As you said, I mean, now the president, Kaide Essebsi, was for Minister of Education with Bourguiba. So we still have those people who were there. But culture. I think also it was a very particular time. It was all the fight for the human rights and the drafting of Human Rights Convention, UN Convention. So it was all linked to an international movement. And as you said, now it needs to come from the basis. We are now in Tunisia in a position in which we will not probably accept top-down laws, but probably grassroots debate.
Very short question and short answers.
My name is Annick Sjögren. I'm an ethnologist, or was. I was very interested by your statistics with the last line, which was 4 minutes 38, I think, percent per day for women looking for jobs. And then you added, and for men it's 20 minutes per day. And the fact that you have that in your statistics was very interesting. Can you just talk a bit about this problem of educated people not having jobs and what it means for women?
Very short. Yes. We will be able actually then to mingle outside. Exactly. I wanted to have that figure because I think it says it all about the repartition of powers and of roles in the society now in Tunisia. If a young girl who is educated and has a university degree stays home because she needs to help her mother in doing the housework and or take care of her children if she is married, she will not have enough time to go and look for a job. whereas men would have far more time. I mean, in this point, it's nearly 10 times more time to be able to find a job. So that's why now in university degree holders, more than half of women are not able to find a job, and only 20% of men are jobless. So I think it's women themselves who need probably, it's just a question of awareness, of being able to find it, but also of creating new instruments. Like for this kind of thing, internet is everywhere now, and probably we need to change our own way of presenting jobs.
Thank you so much for coming, and let us thank the panel for today. Thank you.